Hey, church,
Hey,
Pastor
everybody.
Nate.
Hi. And me, Mike.
I wanted to bring you another video this week. I thought it'd be cool to have my dad here with me. And I wanted to talk to you about Easter a little bit because it's coming up. This is in the middle of the week. Easter's this weekend. A lot of things happen during Easter, and in most years, we have an outreach. We have all these other events that go along with it, and we're not ashamed to purchase thousands of Easter eggs and cover the park in them, and then have at least two teenagers take turns in a big crazy bunny suit
Yep.
and run around and take pictures with kids and families. We think it's great. We believe that's something.
I'm going to miss it.
Yeah, I am too. That's something Pastor Bob Klein used to always talk about, that we're using bait. We're trying to get people to come into the Lord, and we're using something that families connect to do that. And so that's why we have harvest fests during Halloween, and we do different types of things like that. But many people are challenged by those outreach events, and more specifically challenged by the holidays that Christians and non-Christians celebrate. And Easter is one example of that. I don't want to get off the edge, talk about the other ones. It'd be a longer video. But Easter is one of the ones that gets talked about. And there's several different things that gets criticized about Easter. But what I wanted to talk about today is the Easter egg. Can you see that on the camera, Jesus? All right. I wasn't sure if it was the right color to show it visible. It's like a yellowish, tealish, Easterish color. But it's very springy.
Yes.
But these are the eggs that we purchased. They're plastic, and we purchased a lot of them and put them at the park. This year we got them before the shutdown happened.
Right.
So my office has a lot of eggs. So if anybody wants Easter eggs, I'm your guy, because we have to get rid of them. So we've been giving them out at food pantry on Sundays, and families have been really appreciative. So that's great. But anyways, one thing about Easter, you and I were just talking about this.
Yeah.
You cannot argue with the date of Easter.
No, it's a historical fact.
Yeah. Because Easter is set 3 days after the Day of Atonement, which is a part of the Passover celebration in the Jewish religious calendar. Okay? And so there's no debating that. That's just a fact. And Jesus died on the Day of Atonement, which is a whole other sermon. And he died at the end of Passover on the Day of Atonement, and then on Sunday he rose from the dead.
Yes, he did.
And so you can't really argue with the dating of Easter. And also it's extremely important to keep in mind that historically it's a Jewish holiday first, before it's a Christian holiday.
Right.
And for a long time, the two things weren't even separable.
Okay.
Christians and Jews were part of the same faith system for a while.
Yes.
At least the ones that believed in Christ. Nowadays we call them Messianic Jews. Back then they called them heretics.
The rest of the Jews.
Yeah. Or Christians. But like the Romans didn't even see a difference between Jews that believed in Jesus and Jews that didn't.
No.
They grouped them together.
Right.
And the vast majority of early Christianity was Jewish.
Yeah.
And even the Gentiles.
It was a Jewish sect.
Yeah. And the Gentiles, the first Gentiles, the first non-Jews that started coming to Christ, you can see this in the book of Acts, they're not Jews, but they're Gentiles that practice Judaism. They were Jewish by faith, not by race. And that's the first not Jews that begin to accept the gospel. So even then, it's a very, very Jewish faith.
Right.
And even when it began to get to like really pagan people, like Greeks and people way outside the camp of Judaism, the faith system still translated. They still taught them about Moses. They still encouraged them to follow the law to some degree.
Right.
In a different way, but still. And so the Judaism, the culture of the early church was Jewish, and that carried all the way through for a long time. So it's important to keep that in mind whenever you're talking about where did something come from.
Right.
Because there's a good chance looking into Judaism will give you a hint. And that's where you first see Easter eggs. Now, these are plastic, but when I was a kid, we used to use hard-boiled eggs for Easter. And
color them.
Not because there wasn't plastic eggs. That's just what we did.
Yeah.
And I'm sure many families still do that today. You can still go buy the little Easter egg coloring
Kids love
kit.
to do the coloring
It's
part.
fun. Yeah. And they never make the same colors. I've noticed that. Like the purple and blue that comes out of those kits is not what comes in these things.
Not usually, no. But
plus, you can't eat these. That's what I would do as a kid.
Right.
I like to eat, though. So I would sneak it during the Easter egg hunt. I would get the shell off of an egg to eat the things.
Yeah, well, they're still good.
They're still, that's the whole. Matter of fact, still being good is a part of it, because in Judaism, eggs, hard-boiled eggs specifically, were a part of the Passover ceremony.
Okay.
And later on, when people were celebrating Easter and Lent and those types of things, one of the foods that would keep a long time was a boiled egg. And they would hang on to them and store them. And so they became very popular to eat those during those times when they were fasting from a lot of other foods. But in the Seder meal, they would represent sadness and sacrifice, because what they would do is they would roast them.
Yeah.
And that would turn them brown.
Right.
And that would symbolize that some of the sacrifices that were made in the temple were roasted. And they would also dip it in salt water and then eat it that way to remind them of the tears that they cried when they were slaves.
Okay.
Which is the whole Passover, if you don't know, is about the deliverance from the Israelites from Egypt. So that's what the egg during this holiday season comes from. Okay. Right. But there's a lot more. Okay. So first of all, it represents sacrifice and sadness. But that's not what I think of when I see the Easter egg.
No, me either.
You know, I'm always happy to see them. But the second thing, and this might surprise you. Ted, why don't you grab the one you have in front of you?
Yeah.
Let's open these up and see what we got first of all.
Okay.
Oops. Wow, I shot that like a rocket. Don't edit that out, Jesus.
You got candy. Huh?
I got candy. What'd you get?
I got a wristband.
A wristband.
Probably won't fit my wrist.
So when I order these, it says candy or toy.
And this is a toy.
So this is supposed to be a toy. It's a wristband or a rubber band. If you gave us enough time, we could find ways to shoot paper clips with that. Anyways.
Easily. I don't think I can shoot the top of the egg like you did.
Probably could shoot the Tootsie Roll. Anyways.
Maybe. That would work better.
Yeah. So there's toys and candy in them. And that's, believe it or not, that's important. Okay. So let me tell you about Passover a little bit. In Passover, one of the things they had was matzah bread.
Right.
Now, you know about matzah bread. It's not...
The unleavened bread.
Yeah, it's unleavened, which means it's like a cracker. It's not fluffy.
They didn't have time to let the bread rise when they were having to flee Egypt. It was all part of the whole story.
Yeah, that was the symbol, was don't let your bread rise, hurry up and get out of there.
Yeah.
Take it like a cracker. And so that's traditionally, that's what they eat at these times. And you can go to Stater Brothers and buy matzah bread or wherever they sell crackers, and they're these huge crackers, make a big mess, but they're not bad. And you can get these things, and they're still around. People still eat them.
Yep.
And they use them to celebrate the holidays. But in the Passover meal, the whole thing has symbolism and meaning. Everything on the plate does.
Everything.
And one of the things you do is there are 3 different pieces of bread, or loaves, they'll call them in the writings. Well, what that means is big old cracker.
Yeah.
Practically. And so you'll eat 3 of those throughout the meal, and it has different meanings. But the second one is called the afikomen.
Right.
Which is a fun word to say. Afikomen.
Afikomen.
Yeah.
The Jewish children love it.
The Jewish children love it, yes, because what you would do with that cracker is you'd break it. And then there's a specific cloth that they would have that would wrap it up in, so now it's buried. And then they would go and hide it somewhere in the house.
Yeah.
And the children, Passover, we always think of like the Last Supper as this very solemn moment with Jesus and his disciples. But for Jewish people, you have to have children at Passover.
Yeah.
You have to.
They ask the questions.
There's 4 questions.
Yeah.
Why is this night different from all the other nights? And then there's 3 more. The children has to ask the question.
Yep.
And also, when it's time to go find the afikomen, it's the children that go and find the afikomen. And for bigger groups, they would hide multiple afikomens throughout the house. And they would go and hunt for them. And when they would get them, they would bring them back to the adults, who would be required, and the word they used was to redeem them by giving them candy or a toy. Redemption. So they had to buy it back and get the afikomen back before they could continue the ceremony.
Yeah.
And so the child would love Passover because they get a new toy.
Yeah.
They get some candy, you know.
Yep.
And that's still a part of it to this day. That's where all this comes from, the idea of candy in the eggs or toys at Easter baskets. All the gifting that goes on during this ceremony comes from the Afikomen. And hunting the eggs, I'm going to make this one egg. I believe that I can. Yes. Hunting the eggs comes from the ceremony of the children hunting the Afikomen. Right. Okay? And so that's where that comes from. And you can almost see, the second piece of bread, the second member of the Trinity. You can see Jesus being broken, buried, hidden, and causing redemption right then and there.
Wow.
And
good stuff.
Yeah. By the way, the whole Passover meal is like that. You can see Christ.
It all points to Jesus.
It all points to Jesus.
Everything about Passover does.
Yeah, everything about it does. And then literally when Jesus has the Last Supper, that's part of the story, is he's looking at the disciples going, "This is my blood," which is from the Seder service, and it's me. And this is, that piece of bread is broken. He says that in the text, that it's broken, because he's referring to the Afikomen. They don't break the other two. They only break the Afikomen.
Wow, that's
so
right.
He's referring to the second piece of bread, the one that gets buried and hidden and redeems. It's intentional. I could go on about Passover and Seder all day long, and I'm not even the one that knows the most about it. There's a lot of symbolism, in that stuff. But the idea of candy, buying back, redeeming things back. Later on, they begin to hunt the eggs. Okay, imagine a Gentile who doesn't live anywhere near Jerusalem inheriting this ceremony, doing the best they can to figure it out, and they confuse eventually the bread with the eggs. It's not that hard to see, and eventually that's what happens. And so they start hiding the boiled eggs.
We don't have any unleavened bread this time, so we're going to hide eggs.
Yeah, exactly.
Or, maybe it was intentional.
It could have been that. Yeah, it could have been anything. And so, but the idea is that's where you can see where these two practices kind of become cohesive.
Right.
And we know that's true because by the time you get to Martin Luther and the Great Reformation, which is a time you can date and follow his teachings and his writings, he writes about Easter.
Okay.
And he writes about Easter egg hunts, believe it or not.
So they were doing it already.
And by that time, it was old.
Yeah.
He talked about it like it was old, which meant that the Catholic Church was doing Easter egg hunts. And it goes back further back towards church history. And so the eggs were being hunted. And remember I told you they were supposed to roast the egg?
Yeah.
To make it look to roast it, so represent the roasted sacrifice. Well, here's the thing. Historically, just factually, when you roast an egg, it makes it really rubbery and kind of gross.
Yeah.
And so what they would do is they would dye it brown. Okay. Soak it like a tea bag and pickle it so that it would come out looking like it was roasted, but not tasting quite as bad. And
still edible.
Yeah. And the Seder service that I went to once, that's how they did it. Okay. They didn't roast it. They made it colorful. Not colorful, but they made it brown by doing that process because it's hard to get it roasted right, and it's kind of gross when you do.
Yeah.
And so that's where the tradition of coloring eggs comes from, because they were doing that for thousands of years, just colored them brown.
Right. And so the brighter colors came later.
Yeah. Martin Luther in his writing says, let's color them brighter colors. Okay. Because the holiday comes around springtime, and it represents resurrection, life, new birth, all those types of things. And so he's saying, hey, let's color them brighter colors so that it reminds us of joy. Right. Because it's not a sad thing.
No.
And it's empty because they didn't have plastic ones, but they had the boiled ones that had no bird in them, no chicken in them. Right. It's empty in that way because the tomb was empty.
It's an egg. There's no bird in it.
Exactly. Just like the tomb, there's no Jesus in it because he rose.
Right.
And Martin Luther writes about that and talks about that idea. So the Easter egg, while it might look like a weird pagan symbol, but what happened? Bunnies don't lay eggs, But in reality, it represents Jewish sacrifice, death, redemption, and resurrection.
Okay.
Which is the gospel.
Yes,
if you think about it.
Yes, it is.
It's this idea that we all need a sacrifice to cover our sins. Jesus Christ is the one that redeems us, and he rose from the dead, giving us the power to live this life and walk in his presence. And so when you see an Easter egg, I want you to remember Jesus, because that's what it represents, the power, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Hey, we love you. Happy Easter.
Happy
We'll see you
Easter,
soon.
everybody.